Good morning, everybody. I thank Professor Beck, Father Beck, and the Catholic University of Seoul for inviting me to this symposium. Before entering really in the discussion of my article, I would like to add something which does not figure in my article, but which I regretted not to have elaborated on more during the last days before this conference. So that is my impression that as maybe this afternoon, Professor Sung Chan Park will tell us, Thomas Aquinas' theology of creation ex nihilo is nearly perfect, but maybe yet there are at least two things that need an improvement in his theology regarding this concept of the Creatio ex nihilo. So the first one is the Aquinas' assertion that famous assertions according to which God is pure act. And I wished to share you at the very beginning of my talk a completely different point of view, elaborated by Kierkegaard, who was also a very good Christian from Denmark. And instead of saying that God is pure act, he says that God is pure potency. So nearly just the opposite. So I think that maybe the truth could be in between, and that there is act in God, and that there is potency in God, and that might help us to get a more convincing view of the fact that there is a kind of equivalent there is a kind of dynamism in God. There is a freedom in God's love, God's inner love, Trinitarian love, and also that there is nearly a kind of equivalent of time. And this is a controversial question. I think that there are at least four ways to understand God's relationship with time. So the first one is to consider that in God there is no time at all, so God is temporal. The second way is to consider that God is eternal, which for some people is the same thing, but which has been distinguished by some authors. Then in process theology, or at least for some process theologians, then there is the presence of time in God himself. But there is a fourth possibility which I would recommend, and that is, that just comes out from the belief in the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection of bodies. I think that with the resurrection of bodies comes the idea that time and space must also be in a way transfigured. And that does not concern only the life that is waiting for us after the end of times, but maybe this is something that already exists in God. So from a purely theological point of view, my recommendation would be to think that in God there is a kind of transfigured notion of time and of transfigured notion of dynamism, which may help us to enter with better tools into the discussion of ex nihilo creation. So my starting point then for my contribution comes not from Aquinas, but down. Okay, so I would like to find back, a quotation of Karl Barth. This is my starting point. According to Karl Barth, there is a very close relationship between the concept of creation and the concept of covenant. So maybe we can read that together. The existence and being of the Creator, willed and constituted by God, are the object and to that extent the presupposition of his love. Thus, the covenant is the goal of creation, and creation the way to the covenant. So this very intimate relationship between both concepts actually is, although Barth here does not provide any biblical indication that his intuition is correct, I think that it is deeply ingrained in the Bible. I will come to that in a moment. So my idea then was to ask, well, if there is such an intimate relationship between creation and covenant, the concept of covenant, and if, what is more, there is not just one covenant in the history of salvation, but there are several, which is a point which maybe Karl Barth did not consider in detail in this passage, then what about the relationship between the establishment of historical covenants and the concept of ex nihilo divine activity? So that is my starting point, and what I will try to do is to convince you that the establishment of divine covenants, historical covenants, is also can be considered from a certain point of view in a qualified sense, as I said in the title of my paper, and can be considered as a kind of ex nihilo activity. There can be ex nihilo novelty in the historical covenants that are related in the Bible. So what do I mean by saying that this ex nihilo novelty can be considered as such in a qualified sense? The ex nihilo concept, I just take it, I just understand it in the same way as Professor Clavier does, as he will tell us this afternoon. Yet, I think that it is necessary to add that covenants are ex nihilo actions in a qualified sense because some reality already exists when God establishes his covenants. So it's not pure, just creation from nothing and nothing else. God does not destroy what he has already established when he adds some novelty by the means of the establishment of a new covenant. Also, the establishment of covenants is a creational activity in a qualified sense because, in fact, a covenant is not only something that concerns us, but also something that concerns God. So, on God's side, the establishment of a covenant cannot be described as a creational activity. Maybe we have no human term to designate what happens on God's side when he establishes a covenant with us. From our human point of view, then I would say that maybe the establishment of a covenant can be qualified as a kind of ex nihilo novelty. Now, let me, I will try to justify my point of view in more detail in a few moments, but I would wish first of all to come to two interesting consequences of this idea from the point of view of the relationship of faith and science. The first consequence has something to do with the way we can perceive God's activity in our world. Let us take, for instance, the idea that has been developed by Professor Russell for many years already, that at least some part of divine action can be felt by God's intervention at the level of quantum mechanics. Not at the level of the deterministic side of quantum mechanics, but at the level of the randomness of a quantum phenomena. Well, in order for this idea to be acceptable, God must not change the statistics of quantum mechanics. So, what happens if God establishes a new covenant with us? What will be the consequences at the level of the statistic of quantum mechanics, if any? Well, my point is that these consequences will not be perceptible at all. And that's, I think, rather reassuring. Why would it be so? Well, because in order to measure a change in the statistics of quantum mechanics, we would need to be able to reduce with some kind of mathematical formula God's divine activity into a smaller way of perceiving it. For example, if God established a covenant in which he said, well, from now on, I will protect you from global warming. So, using quantum mechanics, I will ensure that if the temperature of the Earth goes too high, then I will myself, by divine activity, make it become lower. Well, if God, maybe from the from the point of view of quantum mechanics, this would be a possible idea. But God's covenant do not work that way. Because in God's covenant, the only thing we know for sure is that we are invited to trust in God and in His covenants. But how can we decipher what God will really do after having established His covenants? Well, in order to know that, we would need to know the heart of God, which we don't. But we still have a kind of mediation which can help us to grasp something about His activity, that is His word. So maybe let us say the whole Bible. But even reading the whole Bible is not enough, because at least according to Christian theology, every time we read God's word under the light of the Holy Spirit, then new insights can come into our hearts. So there is no way to reduce this process, this historical process of God's divine activity, which comes through His covenants. There is no way to reduce it to something smaller than human history itself. So from that point of view, I think that the idea that divine activity can be developed through the paradigm of the establishment of divine covenants is rather interesting. So now there is another point, and which is also can lead to a controversy, and that is about how the establishment of divine covenants may have an impact or not at the level of biological phenomena. So at this level, actually, well, as a kind of joke, I would say that we are 4 French people invited here at the conference, and it seems that when you have 2 French people invited, then you can have a chance that they agree with each other. But if you invite 3, already it's there will be a problem. So I have, just to be honest, I must confess that my way of viewing the evolution, natural evolution, is not quite the same as that proposed yesterday by Father Magnin and Fabien Revol. So there is a 4th Frenchman who will speak this afternoon. So we will see when the 4th one talks if things become even more complicated. Well, what is the problem? What is my problem? Well, before going into the more detail, maybe allow me to tell you a short story about Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin, during many years, he worked in China. And he lived in Beijing for many years, and there were maybe only 3 Catholic missionaries or priests who were intellectuals at the time in the whole city of Beijing. So there was a Franciscan priest who devoted many, many years of his life in translating the Bible in Chinese. His name was Gabriele Allegra. He was an Italian. And there was the Catholic nuncio, so the representative of the Pope in Beijing. So one day the nuncio thought that Teilhard is such a great man, so intelligent, and it's a pity that he has been forbidden to publish any kind of book in theology, and that the Jesuit order only allowed him at that time to publish things in science. So he said, he had an idea. He went to see Father Allegra, the Franciscan, and told him, well, I give you a book about Teilhard de Chardin. It's called the Divine Middle, le Milieu Divin. It's a rather small book of Teilhard. Try to be indulgent and see if you can give him an imprimatur. Allow him to publish this book in the name of the church and with the authority of the church. So Gabriele Allegra read the book, and then he went to the nuncio and said, "I'm sorry, I cannot give the imprimatur." And then he went to see Father Teilhard, and he told him the story. And what is so nice is that after that they became friends. So that tells something of the greatness of the heart of Teilhard de Chardin. So I hope that with my French friends the same kind of thing will happen, that maybe there are a few details about which we disagree, but that will not prevent us from building a strong friendship in the future. Now, to come to the heart of the different points of view, my difficulty actually stems, at least in part, from a remark made by Charles Darwin. So that's what Darwin wrote at the end of his life, when he was becoming more and more agnostic with respect to the Christian faith. So he wrote that there is much suffering in the world no one disputes. Some have attempted to explain this in reference to man by imagining that it serves for his moral improvement. But the number of men in the world is as nothing when compared with that of all other sentient beings, and these often suffer greatly with no moral improvement. A being so powerful and so full of knowledge as a God, who would create the universe, is to our finite minds omnipotent and omniscient, and it revolves our understanding to suppose that his benevolence is not unbounded. For what advantage can there be in the suffering of millions of the lower animals throughout almost endless time? So, in other words, what Darwin taught was that so many animals have suffered through the process of natural selection for so many years, millions of years. And it seems that God made nothing about that. God did nothing to alleviate all these sufferings. So the conclusion for Darwin that maybe, if that is the case, there is no God. Well, my personal belief would be that, well, there is a God, there is a creator, but that at that time, during so many million years, he was silent. And that we need a kind of theology of the cross, well, not maybe exactly Luther's one, because Luther was not, at the time of Luther, there was the question of evolution did not come out. But a kind of theology of the cross which already existed during patristic times. Many authors in patristic times had the idea that the world was created from the very beginning, I mean, with the shape of a cross. Well, that is a kind of image, more than something that must be taken in a very concrete way. But I think that this intuition may be extended. And there has the mystery of the cross has been present in the evolution of the universe, at least since the beginning of biological processes. So it is difficult for me to see clearly the God's presence and God's divine action at the level of purely biological processes. In fact, this is even all the more so from a theological point of view, as a kind of parallel may be established between, well, ex nihilo creation of the world at the beginning and the Big Bang. And it has been stressed by many contributors already that the two should be clearly distinguished. And I would say that the same kind of distinction, or a similar kind of distinction, should be made between, continuous ex nihilo divine activity, which can occur through the establishment of divine covenants, and on the other hand, the dynamics of biological processes. Well, I recognize, I'm ready to recognize that there is a lot of creativity in some way in biological processes, but it's hard for me to see directly the hand of God in this. For me, rather than divine creation present in biological processes, I would rather say that maybe it's a kind of prototype of God's creative activity, which is easier to see through the establishment of divine covenants. But in the end, actually, there is maybe something which may reconcile us. Father Magnin and Fabien Revol and me, and that is what Father Magnin told at the end of his, after his talk yesterday, and during the debate, because he said that for Tela, what was very important was to understand everything from the point of view of, in the perspective of the epistles of Colossians and Ephesians. If we look at things in this way, then I think that my proposal that there is a kind of ex nihilo divine activity in the establishment of divine covenants, historical covenants, fits perfectly in this perspective. Because you have Christ, that is the end of all things, who is the end of all things, but as a kind of concrete way of expressing how we already participate in this mystery and progress towards the mystery of the life of Christ, then we may consider, as the Bible does, that some divine covenants are the means through which we can reach Christ, and through which we will reach Him fully at the end of time. Now I have 5 minutes left, more or less, I think. During this time, maybe I would like to show you a few illustrations of why the establishment of divine covenants can be maybe considered as having a kind of ex nihilo component. So a very, very strong kind of novelty, and the highest kind of novelty that may be conceived of. And I will try to show this, illustrate this through biblical passages, at least 3 of them. So, for instance, this passage in the book of Exodus. Here then, said the Lord, is the covenant I will make. Before the eyes of all your people, I will work such marvels as have never been created in any nation everywhere on earth. So you see in this single verse that the two concepts of creation, but in fact it is continuous divine creation activity that is mentioned here, comes together with the establishment of a covenant. And of course, the book in which we find the greatest number of occurrences of the concept of new creation and linked with the concept of covenant is the book of Isaiah. So I can provide you with at least two examples of these. As Isaiah, second Isaiah, chapter 48, I, says the Lord, make you hear new things from now on, and secret things, and you have not known them. Now they are created, and not in antiquity. Before today you did not hear of them, so that you cannot claim, I have known them. I think that hints to the fact that the kind of novelty that is at stake here is the highest kind of novelty that can be conceived of, the highest kind of novelty that is created. And this is linked in the book of Isaiah with the concept of covenant, because at that time, according to the second Isaiah, God, he is not creating a new world, really, because the world already exists. He's not creating new individuals, because they already exist, but he's creating a new people. Because the people of Israel basically has been destroyed as a people during the exile. So that's the intuition of the second Isaiah. And here is a last quote, a biblical quote, that is also very, very nice and very impressive, very poetic. Lo, I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The things of the past shall not be remembered or come to mind. Instead, there shall always be rejoicing and happiness in what I create. For I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and its people to be a delight. So I didn't listen to the clock, but maybe it's time, more or less. Just as a kind of conclusion, but you can find more about this in my paper. In my paper, close to the conclusion, I tried also to establish some parallels between the concept of continuous creation, ex nihilo, and intuitions that can be found in Oriental religions, especially Buddhism, and a little bit also Taoism. And the only thing I would like to say now about this is that maybe the word consonance that has been advocated by several contributors already, especially Professor Russell, is also quite interesting and valid for in this field of interactions between the Christian faith and other religions. I think that sometimes we can find things that may be qualified as consonances, and these consonances sometimes may help us to give a deeper spiritual meaning to the concept of creation ex nihilo, because very often we concentrate on the metaphysical importance of this concept. But I believe that in the end, this concept has also spiritual consequences, and some of them can be illustrated not only in the Bible or in the works of Christian theologians, but also in other religions, particularly maybe Buddhism, through the concept of samsara. Thank you for your attention.